Welcome to a journey through the world's most disturbing and unsolved cases recorded in history. I invite you to be a part of this chilling exploration. Subscribe to join us as we delve into the mysteries that have baffled experts for decades.
The fog had settled over Millbrook like a burial shroud, transforming the familiar streets of Sarah's childhood into something alien and watchful. She pulled her rental car up to the curb outside 47 Elm Street, the engine's death rattle echoing off the moisture-slicked asphalt. The house looked smaller than she remembered, a tired Victorian with peeling white paint and shutters that hung at defeated angles. 3 months since the funeral, and she'd finally worked up the courage to clean out her grandmother's belongings. The metallic tang of rain hung heavy in the October air, mixing with the scent of rotting leaves and something else. Something sweet and cloying that made her stomach turn. Sarah fumbled with the house keys, her fingers numb from the cold. The brass felt slick against her palm, worn smooth by decades of use. Inside, dust motes danced in the pale afternoon light, filtering through grimy windows. The floorboards groaned under her feet, each step releasing the musty smell of old wood and forgotten time. Grandmother's grandfather clock stood silent in the hallway, its pendulum frozen at 2:17. Sarah made a mental note to wind it later, though she couldn't say why it mattered. The phone rang, shrill and unexpected in the silence. Sarah's heart lurched as she followed the sound to the kitchen, where an old rotary phone sat on the counter like a black plastic spider. She lifted the heavy receiver. Hello. Static filled the line, punctuated by what sounded like breathing. Then nothing. The dial tone buzzed in her ear like an angry wasp. Sarah set the receiver down with trembling fingers. Just old wiring, she told herself. The house had been empty for months. But the silence that followed felt different somehow, expectant, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. The first letter. The next morning brought no relief from the fog. If anything, it had grown thicker, pressing against the windows like searching fingers. Sarah dressed quickly and walked to the post office to forward her grandmother's mail. The building squatted on Main Street like a red brick toad, its windows dark despite the open sign hanging crooked in the door. Inside, the air smelled of old glue and something metallic, like pennies left too long in water. Behind the counter, a thin man with wire-rimmed glasses looked up from his newspaper. His name tag read, Harold Wickham, Postmaster. You must be Eleanor's granddaughter, he said, his voice carrying the flat vowels of rural New England. Terrible loss. She was a fine woman. Thank you. I need to forward her mail to my address in Boston. Wickham nodded and shuffled through a stack of envelopes. Most of it's just circulars and such. Though. He paused, holding up a cream-colored envelope. This one's a bit odd. No postmark. No return address. Just says S. Morrison on the front. Sarah's maiden name. The name she'd used before her marriage, before her divorce, before she'd fled Millbrook 20 years ago. Her hands shook as she took the envelope. The paper felt expensive, heavy, with a texture like skin. Any idea who might have sent it? She asked. Wickham shrugged. Could be anyone. Small towns have long memories. Sarah slipped the letter into her purse and hurried home through the fog. In her grandmother's kitchen, she lit a candle. The power had been spotty since the storm, and sat at the scarred wooden table. The envelope bore no stamp, no postmark, just her name written in elegant script that seemed oddly familiar. Inside was a single sheet of matching paper, folded once. Sarah unfolded it carefully, expecting to find a sympathy note or perhaps a bill. Instead, the page was blank. She held it closer to candle flame, thinking perhaps the writing was too faint to see in the dim light. As the heat touched the paper, words began to appear, faint at first, then growing darker, as if drawn by an invisible hand. Sarah, you remember the summer of 1963, don't you? When little Timothy Walsh disappeared from the quarry. They said he drowned, but you know better. You were there. You saw what really happened. Some secrets never stay buried. A friend. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Timothy Walsh. She hadn't thought about him in decades. The shy boy with the gap-toothed smile who followed her around that last summer before she'd left for college. He drowned in an accident at the old quarry, a tragedy that had shaken the whole town. But as she stared at the words, they began to fade. The ink grew paler, then lighter still, until the page was blank again. Sarah blinked hard, wondering if she'd imagined it all. But the memory of the words remained, burning in her mind like a brand. She held the paper to the candle again, but nothing happened. The heat only made the edges curl slightly, releasing the faint scent of expensive stationery. Whispers in the dark. Sleep came fitfully that night. Sarah tossed and turned in her grandmother's old bed, her dreams filled with dark water and reaching hands. She woke at 2:17, the same time the grandfather clock had stopped, to the sound of knocking. 3 soft taps against the front door. Then silence. Sarah lay still listening. The fog pressed against the bedroom window, and somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked. She told herself it was just the old house settling, but her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. The knocking came again. 3 taps, followed by 4 quick ones. Sarah slipped from bed and crept to the window. The street was empty, shrouded in mist. The porch light cast a weak yellow glow that barely penetrated the fog. No one was there, but on the doorstep, barely visible in the dim light, lay another envelope. Sarah wrapped herself in her grandmother's old robe and went downstairs. The floorboards were cold against her bare feet, and each step seemed to echo through the house like a gunshot. She opened the front door slowly, the hinges protesting with a rusty squeal. The envelope was identical to the first, cream-colored, expensive, with her name written in that same elegant script. This time, she didn't hesitate. She took it inside, lit the candle, and held the blank page to the flame. "Sarah, do you still have nightmares about the water? About the way Timothy looked at you when he went under? You could have saved him, but you chose not to. You let him drown because he'd seen something he shouldn't have. Something about your family. The old mill basement. Your grandfather's photographs." Timothy was going to tell. A friend. The words faded as before, leaving Sarah staring at blank paper. But the accusations lingered, poison spreading through her thoughts. The old mill. Her grandfather's photography studio in the basement where he developed pictures for the whole town. Timothy had been there once, helping carry equipment. He'd been acting strange afterward, avoiding her, whispering to his friends. Sarah pressed her palms against her temples, trying to remember. The quarry, that last day of summer. Timothy had been upset about something, talking about telling his parents, about going to the police. And then the memory slipped away like water through her fingers. The machine remembers. The letters kept coming. Every night at 2:17, the knocking would wake her. 3 taps, then 4. Always the same pattern. Always another envelope on the doorstep. Each letter revealed another piece of Millbrook's buried history. The mill fire of 1958 that hadn't been accidental. The missing children from the 1960s who'd never been found. The town council meetings held in secret. Decisions made in darkness. And always, they came back to Timothy Walsh and that summer day at the quarry. Sarah tried to research the old newspaper archives at the library, but the librarian, a severe woman with steel gray hair, claimed the records from 1963 had been damaged in a flood. She tried asking the older residents, but they either claimed not to remember or changed the subject with nervous glances. It was as if the entire town had agreed to forget. On the 7th night, Sarah heard something else besides a knocking. From somewhere deep in the house came the rhythmic clacking of typewriter keys. The sound was faint but unmistakable, the mechanical percussion of an old manual machine. Sarah followed the sound to her grandmother's study, a small room at the back of the house that she'd barely explored. The door stood slightly ajar, and candlelight flickered within. She pushed it open slowly. An ancient Underwood typewriter sat on the desk, its keys moving by themselves in a steady rhythm. A sheet of paper fed through the roller showed words appearing line by line, as if typed by invisible hands. The truth is in the basement. The photographs never burned. Timothy saw them all. The children, the rituals, the price of silence. Sarah backed away from the machine, her heart pounding. The typing stopped abruptly, leaving only the sound of her ragged breathing. She approached the desk with trembling steps and pulled the paper free. The words were there, clear and sharp in black ink. But as she watched, they began to fade, just like the letters. Within moments, the page was blank. But the typewriter had given her a clue. The basement, her grandfather's darkroom, descent into memory. Sarah had avoided the basement since returning to Millbrook. The narrow wooden steps led down into darkness that seemed to swallow her grandmother's flashlight beam. The air below was thick with the smell of mildew and old chemicals, the lingering scent of photographic developer and fixer. Her grandfather had been a town photographer for 40 years, documenting births, deaths, marriages, and everything in between. His darkroom equipment still sat in the corner, covered by dusty sheets like sleeping ghosts. Sarah searched through boxes of old photographs and negatives, looking for anything connected to Timothy Walsh or the summer of 1963. Most were innocuous: family portraits, school events, town celebrations. But in the bottom drawer of an old filing cabinet, she found something that made her blood run cold. A manila envelope marked "Private Collection" in her grandfather's spidery handwriting. Inside were photographs that should never have existed. Children from the town, some she recognized, others she didn't. But they weren't normal portraits. These children looked terrified, bound, posed in ways that made Sarah's stomach lurch. At the bottom of the stack was a photograph of Timothy Walsh, his young face streaked with tears. Sarah dropped the photos as if they burned her. They scattered across the basement floor like fallen leaves. Now she understood why Timothy had been so upset that summer, why he'd threatened to tell. Her grandfather hadn't just been the town photographer. He'd been something much darker, and she let Timothy die to protect the family secret. The memory came flooding back with sickening clarity. Timothy at the quarry, confronting her about what he'd seen, threatening to expose her grandfather unless she helped him gather evidence. Sarah, barely 18 and terrified of scandal, had pushed him away. He'd lost his footing on the slippery rocks, fallen into the deep water. She could have saved him. She was a strong swimmer. But she'd watched him struggle, watched him go under, and done nothing. Let him drown to keep the secret safe. The author revealed. Sarah climbed the basement steps on unsteady legs, the photographs clutched in her trembling hands. In the kitchen, she set them on the table next to the stack of letters she'd been collecting. In the candlelight, a horrible truth began to take shape. The handwriting on the envelopes. She thought it looked familiar because it was her own, her careful script from years of journal writing, slightly disguised but unmistakably hers. The expensive stationery came from her grandmother's desk drawer, where she'd seen it but not consciously registered it. Sarah had been writing the letters to herself. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Somewhere in her subconscious, the guilt had been festering for 20 years. The return to Millbrook, sleeping in her grandmother's house, being surrounded by the memories she tried so hard to suppress. It all combined to crack the careful walls she built around the truth. She'd been sleepwalking, writing the letters in a dissociative state, then delivering them to her own doorstep. The disappearing ink was a children's novelty item she'd found in her grandmother's craft supplies, perfect for a mind that wanted to reveal the truth but couldn't bear to face it permanently. The knocking, the typewriter, all manifestations of her fractured psyche, trying to force her to remember, to confront what she'd done. But even as Sarah accepted this explanation, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to it, the fog that never lifted, the townspeople's nervous evasions, the way the very air seemed thick with secrets. What if the letters weren't just her own guilt manifesting? What if Millbrook itself was somehow complicit? A town built on buried sins that demanded acknowledgement. The final letter. That night, Sarah didn't wait for knocking. She sat at the kitchen table with a pen and a sheet of her grandmother's stationery, ready to catch herself in the act. But sleep took her despite her vigilance, and she woke at 2:17 to find another envelope on the table. This one was different, heavier. The wax seal bore an impression she recognized, her grandfather's old photography stamp, the one he'd used to mark his official portraits. Inside were multiple pages, covered in her own handwriting but denser, more frantic than the previous letters. As she held them to the candle, words appeared in a rush. "Sarah, you think you understand now, but you're only seeing part of the truth. Your grandfather wasn't working alone. The photographs, the children, it was all part of something larger, a network that included the police chief, the mayor, the postmaster. Half the town was complicit. Timothy wasn't the only one who tried to speak out. There were others. They all had accidents. The mill fire that killed the Henley boy, the car crash that took Susan Morrison, the drowning at Miller's Pond. You didn't just let Timothy die to protect your family. You let him die to protect the entire town's way of life. But the dead don't forget Sarah. And neither does the fog. Look outside. Sarah's hands shook as she approached the kitchen window. The fog had grown impossibly thick, pressing against the glass like a living thing. And within its swirling depths, she could see faces, pale, young faces with accusing eyes. Timothy Walsh stood on her front lawn, his clothes dripping with quarry water, his mouth moving soundlessly. Behind him stood other children, dozens of them, all victims of Millbrook's conspiracy of silence. They weren't ghosts, Sarah realized. They were memories made manifest, guilt given form by a town that had fed on innocence for too long. The price of truth. The final revelation came not in a letter but in a voice. Timothy's voice, carried on the fog-thick air and speaking directly into her mind. You want to know the truth about the disappearing ink, Sarah? It's not disappearing at all. It's just that some truths are too heavy for the human mind to hold permanently. The ink fades because your sanity requires it to fade. But the words remain, burned into the fabric of reality itself. Millbrook isn't just a town with secrets. It's a place where secrets take on a life of their own, where guilt and shame become as real as fog and rain. Your grandfather's photographs didn't just document crimes. They fed something ancient and hungry that lives in the spaces between memory and forgetting. The letters aren't coming from your subconscious, Sarah. They're coming from the town itself, from the collective weight of all the buried sins. You're not writing them. You're just a conduit, the one chosen to receive them because you carry the deepest guilt. Sarah sank to her knees on the kitchen floor, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what she was learning. Millbrook wasn't just hiding its crimes. It was a living entity sustained by them, a place where the boundary between the real and the psychological had worn dangerously thin. The fog pressed closer, and Timothy's voice grew stronger. There's only one way to stop the letters, Sarah. You have to tell the truth. All of it. To everyone. The photographs, the network, the murders disguised as accidents. You have to tear down the walls of silence that keep this place alive. But if you do, if you expose everything, Millbrook will fight back. It will try to silence you the way it silenced us. Are you prepared for that? Sarah looked at the photographs scattered on the table, then at the faces in the fog outside her window. She thought of all the children who died to keep Millbrook's secrets, all the families who'd lost their innocence to feed the town's hunger. She picked up her pen and began to write, not in disappearing ink this time, but in permanent black ballpoint. She wrote about her grandfather's crimes, about Timothy's murder, about the network of complicity that had protected monsters for decades. She wrote until her hand cramped, until dawn broke through the fog, until the truth lay naked and undeniable on the page. When she finished, Sarah folded the confession carefully and walked to the post office. Harold Wickham looked up as she entered, his face pale in the fluorescent light. "I need to mail this," she said, placing the letter on the counter, "to the state police, the FBI, and every major newspaper in New England." Wickham's eyes widened as he read the address labels. "Sarah, you don't want to do this. Think about what you're saying. Think about the consequences." "I've thought about nothing else for 20 years, Sarah replied. "It's time for Millbrook to face what it really is." The fog lifts. The letters went out that morning, and by afternoon, the first news vans were arriving in Millbrook. The fog, which had shrouded the town for weeks, finally began to lift. But as it dissipated, it revealed something unexpected. The town was empty, not abandoned, empty as if the residents had simply vanished, leaving behind only their belongings and the lingering scent of secrets. Sarah walked through the deserted streets, her footsteps echoing off empty storefronts and silent houses. In the post office, she found Harold Wickham's desk covered with letters, Hundreds of them, all addressed to different residents of Millbrook, all written in disappearing ink. The truth about the town's crimes was spreading like a virus, forcing its way into every guilty conscience. But the residents hadn't fled. They hadn't been arrested. They had simply faded, like the ink in the letters. They had been too fragile to survive the weight of exposed truth. Sarah stood alone in the empty town square, surrounded by buildings that looked increasingly insubstantial, as if they too might fade at any moment. She understood now that Millbrook had never been entirely real. It was a collective delusion, a shared nightmare sustained by guilt and silence. By exposing the truth, she had broken the spell that held it together. The writer's confession. Sarah returned to her grandmother's house one last time to collect her belongings. On the kitchen table, she found one final letter, not in her handwriting this time, but in Timothy's childish script. "Thank you, Sarah. We can rest now. But remember, there are other Millbrooks out there, other towns built on buried sins, other secrets written in disappearing ink. The fog never really lifts. It just moves on to the next place that needs to forget. Watch for the letters, Sarah. Watch for the signs. Because once you've learned to read the truth between the lines, you'll never stop seeing it. And sometimes someone needs to be brave enough to make the ink permanent." Sarah folded the letter carefully and placed it in her purse. As she drove away from Millbrook, or what remained of it, she could see fog gathering on the horizon, rolling toward distant towns with their own secrets to hide. In her rear-view mirror, the town flickered like a mirage, there one moment and gone the next. But the weight of the truth remained solid and permanent as carved stone. Sarah drove toward the interstate, toward a world that suddenly seemed full of hidden darkness. And in her purse, Timothy's letter waited, written in ink that would never fade, carrying a responsibility she would bear for the rest of her life. Because some truths once revealed can never be forgotten again. The fog was already gathering around the next town,